Okay, so welcome back into the series on mapping the shadow. Today, I want to bring it back to the key point here, which is why freedom matters. And I'm doing this because this is most likely going to be the last episode for a while of this particular series. So I wanted to bring it full circle and really drive home the point, because this whole series has actually been about freedom. It's been about psychological growth. It's been about understanding conflict in the mind and outer conflict and how to resolve it and what it looks like. It's about understanding the nature of truth and how that unfolds through a dialectic, building on the works of many great thinkers, most notably the idealist thinkers, people like Hegel and Schelling especially. And also in psychology, of course, especially Carl Jung. Many of you might know that I am a certified Jungian coach, and so Jung, needless to say, has an influence on me, and I do think there's a lot of truth in his work. But if we understand what the idealists are getting at here, there's truth in everything, right? You can find truth in everything. As the saying goes, you can see the universe in a grain of sand. But there's also falsity in everything, because quite clearly the grain of sand is not the universe. It might imply it in some way. And so this shadow map actually collects a lot of ideas that I've compiled and is an attempt to synthesize many of them. And as the name suggests, it's actually a mode and model for helping with shadow work as well, and understanding what shadow work is and why it unfolds the way it does, and clearing up a lot of common confusions and misconceptions I see around shadow work. Like, what even is the shadow? Well, it's the parts we repress and deny. Okay, but why do we deny them? What purpose does that serve? Is it a good thing to deny them? Is it a bad thing to repress them? Is it a good thing to make them conscious? And where does evil come into this? Is evil not pretty important to understand? What is projection? Can we safely say that what we're seeing in the world is valid and true? Or can we just not say that at all? Must we just assume that's pretty much all our own projection? And if so, then on what basis are we allowing the shadow work coach or our therapist or our spouse to tell us that we're the one projecting? It falls down. So this is an attempt to honor the truth of both sides. Now then, so the truth in the end is, of course, freedom. So what's that? Well, the great idealist Georg Hegel said that the history of the world is none other than the progress of the consciousness of freedom. So freedom is, yes, on one level, it's what there is, but within that, it contains limitation and conflict. And so a complete realization of freedom is not something that just happens immediately. It's not something that just exists straight away. It's something that has to unfold through a dialectic. And there's many reasons for that, but one pretty key reason is simply that each component of freedom has to unfold in isolation. Like, the various conditions of freedom have to come about. But the thing with conditions is that they tend to compete and conflict. So whether this is your own beliefs or desires, whether this is your intentions versus someone else's intentions, whether this is the conflict between the lion and the antelope, whether this is the energetic conflict between two stars when they collide in space. There is energetic conflict at every level, and it's all necessary, and it all works towards a greater unfolding, ultimately. So in order for there to be anything, there has to be both the implicit and the explicit, or broadly speaking, the unconscious and the actualized world. These are really just implicit and explicit forms of each other. So this progression of the consciousness of freedom, Hegel, and it's key to his philosophy, he saw this unfolding in the world. So right until the present day, he obviously died nearly 200 years ago, but we see his philosophy playing out in much the same way today. You see it in left-right politics. You see it in the recent election of Donald Trump. You see it in the backlash to certain ideologies. You see it in the extreme responses to them. So, it's one thing to have an idea and an opposing idea, like a thesis and an antidote or an antithesis. It's another thing to have such an extreme idea that it's insisting upon itself to the point of self-contradiction and power, and then an opposing idea that meets it in an equal but opposite way. So this is exactly why we have irony in our world. This is exactly why you will see opposite political parties and political views basically accusing the other of doing precisely what they claim not to be doing. So whether they're actually doing the thing they're accusing the other of doing, or noticing that the other side is in truth doing the opposite of what it claims to be doing. Both are very common. And this is precisely for this reason, because the idea becomes detached from the thing it's trying to represent. So there's nothing wrong with the left wing or the right wing at its essence. At some level, they represent things that we need, or things that society needs and that the mind needs in order to become whole. But when taken to an extreme in isolation, it becomes perverted and corrupt and self-contradictory. So there comes into this idea of negation, which is a Hegelian term, which is like when the actual experience deviates from the thing that it purports to be. And so that's experienced as this tension. And it's completely self-contradictory. There's countless ways in which this can be exemplified. So, for example, we might look at something like the idea of freedom itself. Even freedom is an idea. It's also a truth. But in order for that truth to become realized, it has to be experienced as an idea. And so the idea of freedom, taken to its extreme, actually becomes a form of domination or dominion. Because if you just want to be free to an infinite extent, well, you're then going to want that at the expense of everything else. Like to adhere to your own idea of freedom, at least an early stage, rudimentary idea of it, that's going to have to come at the expense of everyone else's. And this is precisely what Hegel was talking about in the master-slave dynamic. Hence, the idea of freedom is not true freedom. The idea of anything is not the thing in itself. And so you take freedom to such an extreme, that becomes dominion. But guess what? That's also kind of the same thing as slavery, because your idea of freedom is not true freedom. It's not the full realization. And so, ironically and counterintuitively, you then actually become a slave to your own pursuit of freedom. You're not actually free at all. And so this is precisely why limitation is contained within freedom. There's other ways of looking at this as well. Another way of looking at it is whatever is brought into existence through will must set up a kind of limitation, because it must be based on other conditions. And the simple reason for that, and it sounds simple, but it's actually kind of hard to understand, is that the mind must maintain non-contradiction. You're not suddenly just going to start seeing cars flying around. The law of gravity is not just going to change overnight. It might appear to, like if something tragic happens to the earth, but the law of gravity will stay the same. And the point is that the mind is not just going to suddenly start rendering things in a completely different way that violates what has come before. It cannot violate what has come before, because that's completely inconsistent with itself. It would be to deny the very thing it needs to deny anything in the first place. It couldn't work. So there'd be no existence if that was possible. So the fact that we have an existence, and the fact that the mind works in this way, it has to. It's the only way the mind can actually work. So in keeping with that, there's this element of truth. There's this element of what has been fixed and established in the mind, i.e. the past. I think of this as, I call it the law of necessity. It sort of builds on the idea of manifestation. There is this, for want of a better word, manifestation that goes on. But then with that, you have compensation, because in bringing anything about, you create its opposite, because you're coming back to wholeness. And through that, there's also what I'd call the law of necessity, which is that in order for anything to come about, there's not only a compensation, but there's a necessity for it to come about. And this must be fixed in line with what the mind already knows to be true. So that's why we have a limitation within freedom, because the very limitation is the product of freedom. There's no such thing as freedom without limitation. It wouldn't make sense to the mind. And if there's one thing the mind is, ultimately at its core, it's rational. It checks out in the end. So this process is happening to you. This is your own journey as well. You sit within this. So your own history, if you do it well, is the progression of your own freedom. So that invites the question then of what actually is freedom. Again, we might all think we have an idea of it, as I just alluded to on this previous slide here, talking about freedom and limitation. The idea of freedom is not true freedom. True freedom is something that's realized through this process, this unfolding. But we're going to try and get a better intellectual grasp of it here. In brief, freedom can be understood as self-determination through rational self-consciousness. So that's a very concise way of summarizing what I just said. It means acting according to your own rational nature. So in other words, you can do whatever you please, right? This is a philosophical point, a metaphysical point. You can do whatever you choose to do. That is freedom. You can jump out of a window, you can steal from a shop. I'm not suggesting you do any of this, obviously, but you can do any of this. You can do any of it. There's no physical restriction to you doing any of that stuff. What there is, though, this is not me saying it, this is not something that the world imposes on you. What there is your own self-contradiction. You will contradict yourself if you violate other people in that way. And this is not something that, again, the world does to you. Like, the world will throw you in jail probably if you go around stealing. But that's actually taking your own thesis to its own logical conclusion. So the prison service, assuming that it's fair and just, which it often isn't, but in principle, it's an imperfect system, but in principle, it's actually a reflection of the will of spirit itself. It's actually taking your own logical thesis, like, okay, I'm going to violate the rights of others to accentuate and isolate my own. Well, actually, that's just taking your own attitude and reflecting it back. So yes, it was done to you, but actually it's also kind of created by you because it's taking your own logic. And so this is another reason why freedom means acting according to your own rational nature, and that the world is created through that same rational unfolding. In other words, it's trying to become ever more non-contradictory. To go around stealing and expect to not have some kind of consequence would be a self-contradiction. And there's many other ways this shows up, which I've tried to illustrate throughout this series. One I mentioned recently that I'll touch on again is like this idea of helping people, right? If you really want to help someone and you help them in the way that you think and feel best, and you do so unsolicitedly, and it like makes you feel good, right? Because maybe your persona is like you want to be seen as someone who's really helpful. So what do? You go out and you try and help this person as much as possible. And even upon doing that, this person, this friend of yours, or perhaps this child of yours says to you, look, please stop helping me. Like, you've gone beyond the point of just actually like, I appreciate the initial attempt, but you're still trying to help me and it's not helpful. It's actually counterproductive. So depending on how far you've had to push this friend of yours or this child of yours, they're going to be sort of increasing the boundary. And at a certain point, they're literally going to be saying, look, you're no longer helping. In fact, you're actually being counterproductive here. You say you want to help me, and here I am telling you how you can actually help me. And how you can actually help me is to stop trying to help me, right? So at this point, it's like the friend is saying, here's how you can actually help me, and you, in your desire to be seen as helpful, don't want to hear it. So it calls into question the very nature of that help. Is it this or is it that? Is it really a genuine desire to help? Or is it something else? And if it's this something else, then what actually is it? And whatever that thing is, why is it coming under the guise of help? So a number of reasons. Firstly, this person has not differentiated between the mere appearances of help and actual help. And if this is you, then you probably still think you're genuinely being helpful in that situation. In other words, that it hasn't undergone the dialectic. It hasn't reconciled with its opposite. Even in the face of this person saying, do not help me. But if you're not embodying empathy and you're not willing to go through that work and that tension, what's going to happen? Well, we talked about defense mechanisms a few episodes ago. There might well be several of those that come into action. One of which is likely to be rationalization. So it's a way of expediently bridging the dissonance between the belief about oneself that I am the ultimate, most helpful, loving person in the world, and this other data point over here of my friend telling me that I'm not being helpful. Well, how can I possibly explain the existence of those two things simultaneously? Well, I'll just accuse the friend of being ungrateful. That'll do it. I'm a great friend, so we're a great parent or whatever. So that is an example of self-contradiction. It's like you want to be helpful, but you also want to be unhelpful. In other words, the idea of helpfulness has fallen down. It's generated its own internal contradiction. It's not actually the thing it purports to be at all. It maybe was a vehicle for it, but that vehicle eventually needs to break down because it needs to make way for new aspects of the essence of what's implicit to come through and to be realized. So in involving yourself in this dialectic, you're actually getting involved in spirit's unfolding. You actually are engaged in the unfolding of spirit throughout history. And that's what you're here for, in whatever form that takes. In whatever form that takes is according to your own rational nature. So this is not something that you consciously choose. Like, you don't consciously choose your DNA. You don't consciously choose your parents. Now, Schelling has some very deep thoughts on this, about this sort of indistinguishable force or character that maybe on some deeper level we kind of do choose, although choose is probably the wrong word. It's more like that from some perspective that's outside of time, let alone space, it's happening the way it needs to happen. There's something going on that we are self-determined in some way that is beyond what we know to be ourselves consciously. And that also opens up this idea of how all the struggle we experience, all the pain we experience, has a kind of purpose and teleology. That even though egoically we not only don't find it very nice when it's happening, not only don't want it, but maybe can't want it. Maybe we can't like it. Maybe the whole point is that we have to suffer through it. And that's not in its entirety a bad thing. You take the suffering, the suffering is painful. The suffering is in isolation, by definition, a bad thing. But we also know that that's a discrimination by the mind. And that in truth, you can't actually separate the suffering and the struggle from everything else. It all exists in relation to everything else. So you remove the suffering, you remove the meaning, you remove the growth. If you want to escape suffering, the easiest way to do that is to abolish your empathy. And I certainly wouldn't recommend that. So empathy, therefore, of course, being not just empathy for others, but empathy for yourself. I define empathy as a willingness to meet and be transformed by experience. Well, that's the experience of what you are feeling as well as what other people are feeling. What is it that you're really feeling? Are you just not allowing yourself to experience that? So it unfolds to your own rational nature, which there's a kind of fixity to that, but it's also unfolding dynamically in time, just like the wider world around you. So even though you don't consciously choose it, there's a sort of template. I suppose like an analogy for this would be your personality type or your tarot birth chart, but it's way more, like infinitely more intricate than any of those things. And so paradoxically, true freedom is living in line with what you already are implicitly. And so your own progression towards freedom is a greater realization of what you are implicitly. Let's move on to the second point here. So freedom, aside from being in accordance with your own rational nature, also involves recognition. So this means like the recognition of others as well. If you were the only person on earth, it's hard to say you'd be truly free. Like, you'd be free in a sense, but you wouldn't be fully recognized as a completely autonomous, self-conscious human being. You would have no way to recognize yourself. So the recognition of others matters, and that's a key part of how it unfolds through history and through your own life in society. This is what initially gives rise to the master-slave dynamic that I discussed in that previous episode. Because the master is trying to gain recognition from the slave is also actually trying to gain recognition from the master. But because, initially at least, neither of them recognize the autonomy of the other, and they're just, by default, habitually trying to assimilate and negate that which it encounters in the world, including other people, they enter into a conflict. And one of them seems to come out on top, and they become the master, but the slave also has certain advantages in that, and that they end up actually producing something off their own back. And so there's this mutual recognition, but it breaks down. And so true recognition in a healthy relationship develops when you recognize the other person's autonomy. And so anytime a relationship of any kind breaks down, it always involves a failure of recognition, or an unwillingness on one side or the other to recognize the autonomy of the other. It's just, there's a perpetual master-slave dynamic, or at least an attempt to maintain one. at least in some capacity, on some level. And likewise, by the same token, all healthy relationships are based in this fundamental mutual recognition. And so I actually cover this off in my 7 habits model, particularly in habits 1 and 2. So habit 1 is called take responsibility for your mind. And just as a starting point there, this basic habit is the most important thing when it comes to healthy relationships and mutual recognition. It has very little to do with your Myers-Briggs personality type. It has very little to do with your tarot birth chart, in fact, when it comes to relationships. I mean, there's a lot you can gain from both of those tools. I use both extensively. And they're both very useful tools. But in terms of a predictor for relationship success, there's something that's far, far more fundamental. And that is quite simply whether or not both people are taking responsibility for their mind. That's habit 1. Practicing empathy, right? Being willing to meet and transform. They can have completely different interests, completely different personalities, star sign, doesn't matter. What matters is that basic habit and that basic realization. And that starts with an understanding. So that's the second point. It involves recognition. And the third point, which I've already talked about really, is that it develops historically through a dialectic. So just as much as you are undergoing your own dialectic, as illustrated in the shadow map, on a daily basis, you get up in the morning, you eat breakfast, perhaps, you go throughout your day, and then you come back at the end of the day, you fall asleep, you venture forth, you come back, you create something, then you assimilate what you've left behind. You go forth, you take an action, you eat something, or you move somewhere, it creates a consequence. You make sales in your business, then you double, triple, quadruple your sales, and you start to notice there's actually externalities being created. The felt benefits is not linear, it's diminishing. Why is that? Because it's not the real thing, because it deviates from the thing that it serves. Nothing wrong with that. It just creates a problem when you don't realize it. So that creates negation, that gives rise to things you haven't considered, things that are part of the essence that you've left out. And this shows up in the form of a shadow, which has both light and dark sides. So this is happening on a micro scale. It's happening on the macro arc of your life. Right? The shadow in psychology is really the term used to describe this at a personality level as it unfolds over the macro arc of your lives. Now, there's probably a billion different shadows that each of you have, right? But there's also like a small number of primary ones that pertain to your personality and your experience. And so part of the shadow mapping offering is that I will work with you to really clearly delineate these out. It's really about literally mapping it out so you know what it is. And therefore you can work with it. You can use tools from the 7 habits to work with it, to become more conscious of it. And so this is happening to you on a life scale. This is also what spirit is doing. This is what Hegel's philosophy was all about. The development of history is the unfolding of spirit itself, coming to know itself and becoming fully responsible for itself. Hence why responsibility is so powerful. So onto a quote from Schelling next. He said, "Here lies the point at which necessity and freedom must be unified. Necessity and freedom are in one another as one being that appears as one or the other only when considered from different sides. In itself freedom, formerly necessity." So this touches on what I was saying earlier around how freedom is actually contained, well, rather limitation is contained within freedom. And the idea to want to have freedom without limitation is one-sided. It doesn't exist. You cannot have it. In fact, say if you were producing a piece of art, you're making a painting or something, there's limitation inherently. If you had no limitation, there'd be no paintbrushes, there'd be no canvas, there'd be no frame to the image. So what could it possibly mean to have freedom without limitation? Sometimes when people have asked me, what is freedom? Like, what do you mean by freedom? I will respond, what isn't freedom? Can you think of something that isn't freedom? Because everything you see around you, even the institutions of the world, even prison, even crime, even generosity, even love, it's all part of freedom. All limitation is set by freedom, partly because it actually is needed for freedom. It sets up freedom. There'd be no freedom without it. Schelling driving that point home here. He also said, only the eternal is in itself as based in itself, will and freedom. The concept of a derived absoluteness or divinity is so little contradictory that it is rather the central concept of philosophy as a whole. Such a divinity befits nature. So little does immanence in God contradict freedom, that precisely only what is free is in God, to the extent that it is free, and what is not free is necessarily outside of God, to the extent that it is not free. So there's a lot to take from this, but I like the idea that what is in God is free, and what is not free is necessarily out of God, because God is freedom, and freedom is what there is. When you break it all down, freedom is what there is, and what you experience is just the unfolding of that. So that's pretty important, I think. If we recognize that consciously, because the unfolding, the dialectic is happening anyway, but Hegel would have said that this realization is actually part of that same process. So the conscious awareness of the process itself, however you want to look at that, whatever philosophical lens you want to view that through, that realization is both part of the unfolding itself and is also in some ways a cause of it. Like when you become aware of this, what I'd refer to as a meta lesson around how these things actually work conceptually. It's like the pattern of the patterns, right? And realizing that is a key part of shadow work. It's a key part of individuation. So what Schelling is also getting at here is this idea of a derived absoluteness or divinity. And so this is what you and I have, right? We have a kind of derived absoluteness. We're not the absolute, but we're part of it. We have a piece of it. We come from it. And that's also why we have evil in the world, because you can actually use that absoluteness to do evil. Evil is not merely the absence of good, as Jung would have reminded us, and all of these guys would have reminded us. It's actually the active violation of itself. And furthermore, the worst evil is not merely that which is just a violation of freedom of others. It's actually the use of one's own specific gifts and essence to do evil. So it's not merely an absence of good. Not only is it not merely something antithetical to good, but is the proactive use of those very same gifts for the violation of freedom itself. So again, Schelling is saying here that freedom and God are virtually synonymous, and that actually in becoming more and more free, you're actually becoming closer to God. And I remember some time ago, I gave a talk where I talked about my 7 habits model, and someone piped up in the audience and sort of said, well, what this is missing is a connection to God. And what I failed to tell them at the time is that between you and me, it's all a connection to God. So anyway, I think this is the last quote now from Schelling. He said, one who has tasted freedom can feel the longing to make everything analogous to it, to spread it throughout the whole universe. One who does not come to philosophy by this path follows and merely imitates what others do without any feeling for why they do it. So we did look at this briefly a couple of episodes ago, but I want to leave you on that. If you've tasted freedom, hopefully some of the ideas shared in this series have given you some of the building blocks to help you think about that, about what it is you're doing, why you're doing it, what it is you're coming up against in your shadow, in your antithesis, what your persona is, and what the dark form of that might be. Despite its virtues and the benefits of your skills, talents, preferences, and gifts, what is the dark side of that very same proclivity? How does that lead to a shadow, and what is it that you can therefore do about it? There's always more to be said on such things, and if you've enjoyed this series, and I think you'll also enjoy my Know Yourself program, which is a 5-course self-study program available at knowyourself.makeitconscious.com. You can take the whole lot together, or you can take them individually. Each course is also standalone. So there's the Make It Conscious Philosophy course, the Active Imagination course. It's called How to Talk to Yourself. There is Inner Shadow Work, Outer Shadow Work, and The Way of Individuation, which is all about the 7 habits model. In addition to that, there's also the shadow mapping service, which you can check out at makeitconscious.com. So if you're interested to map your own shadow and delve deep into the inner workings of your own mind, that's something we can work on together. That includes 3 coaching sessions and a report for you to keep and peruse in your own time. So that all said, thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you in a future video.